This is Mirrors, a collection of horrors, history, and hauntings. I'm your host, Gabby. We're back talking about the Lizzie Borden house, and we have so much more to discuss, so let's jump right in. But first, if you haven't listened to part 1, go and do that. In that episode, I went over some background on the Borden family, the days leading up to the murders, and the events of August 4th, 1892. Today, we'll be delving deeper into the immediate aftermath of such a shocking crime in Fall River, Massachusetts. Andrew and Abby Borden were dead, having been killed in unimaginable, gruesome manners. The town was trying to grapple with that. How could this have happened? Why would this happen? Could this happen again? But of course, the main question on everyone's mind was who? Who did this? Unfortunately, the investigation and trial may have only led to more questions. To get started, I wanted to describe the layout of the Lizzie Borden house while giving you a brief refresher of the murders. I'll be putting out a video about the house, so that will help to give you the visuals. But for now, I think the house's setup is critical to the story, especially in talking about the investigation, so I'll try my best to paint a picture. The house has 2 entrances, the main door taking you to the street out front. When you go through this door, there's a staircase directly to the right, leading up to the 2nd floor. Unlike how we picture like a typical house, this one doesn't really have hallways. Most rooms are directly attached to each other. An intruder wouldn't have had many places to hide, and they would have had to be familiar with the house's layout to move through the house unseen and unheard. Still, it's really hard to imagine these murders could have been quiet enough to not be heard. On the 1st floor, there's 2 sitting rooms, the dining room and the kitchen. The first sitting room is directly to the left when you come through the front door, while the main living room is straight ahead once you're inside. This is where Andrew Borden was murdered. If you take that front staircase to the upstairs, the guest room would be to your left. While ascending the stairs, you can actually see into the guest room. So the body of Abby Borden would have been visible from the staircase as she was laying face down on the floor and could have been seen under the bed. Going up this staircase, you also have direct access to Lizzie and Emma's room. Emma's room is kind of strange because it's like off of Lizzie's room, and it's kind of like if you were to picture a large walk-in closet. Like that's how Emma's room was to Lizzie's. It was smaller and just kind of like off to the side of her bedroom. The other entrance, which is on the side of the house, would lead you to a separate staircase. This is where Abby and Andrew would have likely entered the home, as this staircase takes you up to their bedroom. You can access their room from the front door, but you need to go through Lizzie and Emma's room. Again, lack of hallways, so these rooms are back to back. Bridget would have likely used this entrance as well. It takes you right into the kitchen, and this is the only staircase with access to the 3rd floor where she lived. These stairs can also take you down to the cellar. More on the cellar later. The layout of this house adds a whole new level of complexities to the case. A physical representation of one of New England's greatest mysteries. After the discovery of the bodies, as officers and neighbors came onto the scene, there was something that was causing everyone to pause. Or someone. Lizzie Borden, who seemed fairly unaffected and emotionally detached from everything going on. Lizzie, who felt the need to correct a police officer that referred to Abby as her mother. "She is not my mother. She is my stepmother," Lizzie said coldly. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think this is a clear sign of her guilt. As someone who's lost a parent and is genuinely incapable of crying about it, I understand that grief impacts every person so differently. And it is impossible to imagine how Lizzie would have been feeling in this particular situation. So no one can really fault her for resorting to survival mode and not thinking properly. Do I think Lizzie's matter-of-fact reaction to all of this is strange? Yes, but I don't see this as a key point of the case against her. This specific exchange with the police officer could have shifted public opinion of Lizzie, though, giving others insight into the inner workings of the Borden family. Abby and Lizzie had a strained relationship. I doubt that was a secret, but the town of Fall River likely didn't know the extent. And I don't think even today, we will ever really know what that relationship was truly like. But it just left everyone in Fall River asking, was this enough of a motive to murder? As you'll recall from part 1, Abby Borden sustained 19 wounds, and Andrew between 10 and 11. There had to be some clear motive. This didn't seem random or spontaneous. The bodies were moved to the dining room, and in that very room, the autopsies were performed. Doing this in the home or at the crime scene wouldn't have been uncommon back then, but it does add a disturbing element to the story. I mean, Abby and Andrew had eaten breakfast there hours before. There's a common belief that the bodies were laid across the dining room table, but they actually would have been on undertaker boards, which were wooden stretchers commonly used at the time for post-mortem examinations and to transport bodies. This was done on August 4th, the day of the murders. Fall River journalists would go on to criticize how the investigation was handled, for their negligence is probably why the case remains unsolved today. First of all, the fact that so many people were coming to the house, between law enforcement, doctors, neighbors, the crime scene would have been contaminated. Obviously, DNA, fingerprinting, and other forensic analysis were not available to investigators back in 1892, but with so many people in the house, crucial evidence could have been moved even if it was unintentional. It could have intensified an already chaotic environment too, distracting police and letting important details go unnoticed. This also gave Lizzie the opportunity to walk freely around the home. If she was the murderer, she would have had time to hide or destroy evidence. The night of the murders, an officer saw Lizzie going down into the cellar alone, which he thought was suspicious, but he didn't follow her or ask questions. Later, what is thought to be the murder weapon was found in the cellar. A hatchet was discovered on August 6th, 2 days after the murders. Well, it was a hatchet head with a broken handle, which confused investigators. It was also covered in dust, which could have been because it was down there for a long time, or because someone had intentionally tried to make it appear that way. The head had no blood or tissue on it, but the handle break did look somewhat new, hinting that the hatchet was used recently. There were other hatchets and axes in the cellar, although they really did seem to have been there for a long time untouched. There's so much mystery around this murder weapon, mainly because the case is often referred to as an axe murder. But with the precision of the wounds, a smaller, more controllable weapon like a hatchet was more likely used than a large axe. Also, these murders going unheard by Lizzie and Bridget, unless they were lying, led investigators to lean toward a smaller weapon as well. But the real murder weapon was never confirmed. It could have been hidden or disposed of somehow. Alternate theories consider a blunt force object rather than a bladed weapon, such as a fireplace poker. With the wounds, a bladed weapon makes more sense, but who knows? It could have been a meat cleaver or even a clothing iron. If that's the case, perhaps the murder weapon was an everyday tool that was clean and left to hide in plain sight. Something else was found in the basement. A bucket of bloody rags. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is a huge deal. A clear, undeniable clue that someone in the house committed the murder, cleaned themselves up, and tried to hide the evidence. But this would be quickly brushed off. Lizzie explained that these rags were from her period. And you mention a period to a man back in 1892, they're not going to ask any follow-ups. And again, no way to test the blood back then to know if Lizzie was telling the truth. This detail represents a bigger element to the story. During the early investigation, Lizzie wasn't seriously questioned, solely because people didn't believe she could possibly have done this. Because yes, her behavior was suspicious, between her lack of emotion and frequently changing stories. But she wasn't seriously looked at as a potential murderer at first. Women didn't commit murder at this time, especially not one like this one. And while she was mysterious and often cold toward the outside world, Lizzie was still seen as a proper Victorian woman. She was a Sunday school teacher. Sure, maybe she shoplifted. That didn't mean she had it in her to hack her stepmother and father to death. If a thorough initial search had been done, perhaps police would have been able to answer another mystery from the murders. What was Lizzie wearing? The police didn't really look through Lizzie's things, as it was seen as improper to go through a woman's belongings. Nor was her person searched. So she could have easily gone to her room, hid what she was wearing, and changed. It's possible she even put a clean dress over the bloodied one, or was wearing some sort of apron or something to cover her dress. No matter what possibility you look at, it's hard to believe because you'd think a crime like this would produce a lot of blood and be impossible to clean up so quickly. I mean, whoever committed the crime managed to not leave behind any bloody footprints or a blood trail of any kind. It all seems just impossible. There was even little blood spatter, which suggests each hit was methodical to keep blood from getting on the murderer. Also on August 6th, a funeral took place in the front sitting room at the home. Emma returned from her time away, and Lizzie, while facing mounting suspicion from the town, was present. Andrew and Abby's bodies were embalmed and actually laid in open caskets. Open caskets. Again, another hard-to-believe detail given how destroyed their bodies were. It said the funeral was somber and a relatively private event, despite the media attention this case was getting. Okay, back to Lizzie and this whole what was she wearing question. The morning after the murders, Lizzie Borden made a grave mistake. In the kitchen of the house that was still very much under the watchful eye of police, she burned a dress. She said the dress had been stained with paint, so it needed to be burned. But the timing is so weird. Why, of all things, would this be what she's worried about the morning after her father and stepmother were brutally murdered? And she had to know this would raise eyebrows. Maybe this dress was covered in blood, and she was desperate to destroy evidence. So desperate, she'd take a major risk to get it done. Another strange thing about this is that, as we've established, Mr. Borden was very frugal. So the family tended to make use of what they had. Surely Lizzie could have found a use for the fabric, even if it was stained with paint. So while there was a bias that women couldn't commit a gruesome crime, there was suspicion against Lizzie, all of which would lead to her arrest on August 11th. A private inquest had begun 2 days prior to gather testimonies and look at all the evidence. After her arrest, Lizzie entered a plea of not guilty, although she would then spend 9 months in prison awaiting a trial. In late August, a preliminary hearing was held in which Lizzie was determined probably guilty and ordered to face a grand jury. Something you may not have known is that Lizzie was not the only suspect arrested, nor was she the first. In what would prove to be another major shortcoming of law enforcement, a man was arrested shortly after the murders, seemingly for no reason. He would eventually be released because he had no connection to the crime. There was literally no evidence to go off of. But he was a Portuguese immigrant, an easy target given the town's prejudice, likely more caught up in a wrong place at the wrong time situation than anything. In November of that year, a grand jury convened to review the evidence. At this time, Lizzie's neighbor, Alice Russell, stepped forward to share the story I told you in part 1. The night before the murders, Lizzie had gone to Alice, expressing her fear that her father had enemies targeting their family. Just 2 days after Alice's testimony, the grand jury issued an indictment against Lizzie for 2 accounts of first-degree murder, which meant she would officially be going to trial. They'd been undecided about whether or not to indict her, but it seems that Alice's testimony pushed them to do so. Alice also brought up the dress burning incident, which she was a witness to. Specifically, she said she saw Lizzie burning a blue dress, which rang alarm bells for investigators, who recalled Bridget saying something about Lizzie wearing a dress the morning of the murders, which was, oh yeah, blue. On June 5th, 1893, the trial of Lizzie Borden opened at the New Bedford courthouse. The case was highly sensationalized, with the trial itself proving to be quite theatrical. The skulls of Abby and Andrew Borden were actually brought into the courtroom. After the murders, their bodies had been stored in a receiving vault in the Oak Grove Cemetery, but they'd actually been exhumed. Their skulls were removed from their bodies and cleaned to give the medical examiner a better look at the wounds. Having the skulls present in the courtroom was genuinely shocking, and it could even be seen as a tactic to garner sympathy for Lizzie, because when she saw the skulls, she actually fainted. Was this faked? That's another question we'll never really have the answer to. But her reaction is totally valid, given the fact that she's looking at the skulls of her father and stepmother. The hatchet believed to be the murder weapon was held up against the skulls, comparing the blade to the fractures. The Bordens' maid, Bridget Sullivan, took the stand, offering one of the most impactful testimonies of the case. She recalled the events of August 4th. Remember, Mr. Borden had gotten locked out of the house that morning. When Bridget had gone to let him in, she heard Lizzie laughing at the top of the stairs. The top of the stairs that would have been right outside the guest room where Abby Borden was dead. And back to what I was saying at the beginning, where you are able to see into the guest room and would have seen Abby's body if you were at the top of those stairs. So if that's true and Lizzie really was there, she would have seen the body. So why wouldn't she have told anybody about it? Bridget also addressed her own alibis, washing the windows and then resting up in her room while the murders happened. So, while she confirmed that yes, Lizzie was in the house at the time of the murders, she didn't allude to any severe, obvious hatred between Lizzie and Abby, going as far to say everything was pleasant. She said sometimes they didn't eat together, but they never intentionally avoided each other or didn't speak to one another. Eli Bentz, the local pharmacist, offered his testimony as part of the prosecution as well. He shared the story of Lizzie trying to buy prussic acid, more commonly known as cyanide, before the murders. However, this incident was eventually excluded from the trial altogether, deemed irrelevant. Because the actual murders were committed through a vastly different method and on a different day, it was said to not be connected. Personally, that doesn't make any sense to me at all, but that's what happened. Other points against Lizzie discussed her changing stories, her apparent lack of emotion immediately after the murders, the fact that there was no sign of a forced entry, the dress burning incident, and the clear motive of her father's money and her strained relationship with Abby. In Lizzie's defense, her sister Emma took the stand. As you'll remember, Emma was out of town during the murders, which has since inspired questions about whether she could have been aware of what was going to happen and left town to avoid being connected in any way. In her testimony, she admitted that she and Lizzie didn't like Abby, but said Lizzie had no reason to hate her, let alone murder her. And even if she did, she had no motive to kill their father as well. Dr. Bowen then gave a testimony, detailing his perspective of Lizzie's demeanor, as she had gone to him directly after the murders, and he'd been one of the first to see Andrew's body. He was the one that pronounced him dead, even though, it was quite obvious. Dr. Bowen, too, thought Lizzie was unnaturally calm, although he attributed this to shock. And he ended up being really beneficial to the defense because he told the jury about the morphine and sedatives he'd given Lizzie after the murders, which could have explained her subdued state and her confusing, changing stories. Reverend Buck and other members of the local church community took the stand, painting Lizzie as a kind-hearted, church-going woman incapable of murder. The defense really leaned into the lack of physical evidence. After all, Lizzie had never been seen covered in blood or even looking disheveled after the murders. And it's hard to imagine she would have been able to clean herself up so quickly and thoroughly. The judge clearly favored Lizzie, disregarding the poison buying situation and emphasizing that circumstantial evidence wasn't enough to prove her guilty. Despite everything covered during the trial and the seemingly endless string of questions about these murders, the jury convened for just 90 minutes, and they ruled Lizzie not guilty. That's right, Lizzie Borden, who lives in infamy as an axe murderer, was actually acquitted for a crime that was committed likely not even using an axe. Upon hearing the verdict, Lizzie leaned forward, resting her head and sobbing. When you visit the Lizzie Borden house, one of the first things your guide will point out to you is a photo of the 12 male jurors, which hangs in the front sitting room. The jury actually gifted a framed photo of themselves to Lizzie after the trial, representing their support for her. Public opinion was, at this point, very much divided on Lizzie, with many believing she was a murderer who somehow garnered enough sympathy to let her walk free. So, the mystery persists. Did Lizzie Borden kill Andrew and Abby? Well, we may not get our answers. But if I've learned anything from the paranormal, it's that mysteries like this one facilitate a sort of energy. A haunting. And the Lizzie Borden house happens to be one of the most haunted places in New England, as well as the entire United States and probably even the world. Join me next week as I spend the night in the house, specifically in Andrew and Abby's bedroom. I seriously cannot wait to tell you about my investigation and my experiences in the house. But until then, you know what to do. Stay spooky. This has been Mirrors, Horrors, History, and Hauntings. Produced and hosted by Gabby Hope Fry.